Boys, our little grey buddies are telepathic, and they seem to pass this ability on to us through the air. We catch it even when we don't catch the fungus. And while you think a little mind reading could be fun, a sort of thing that would make you the life of the party, I can tell you what lies a little farther down the road. Schizophrenia, paranoia, separation from reality, and total, I say again, total fucking insanity. The think tank boys, God bless them, believe that this telepathy is relatively short-acting now, but I don't have to tell you what could happen in that regard if the grey boys are allowed to settle in and be comfortable. I want you fellas to listen to what I'm going to say now very carefully. I want you to listen as if your lives depended on it. When they take us, boys, say again, when they take us, and you all know there have been abductions. Most people who claim to have been abducted by aliens are lying through their asshole neurotic teeth, but not all. Those who are let go have often undergone implants. Some are nothing but instruments, transmitters perhaps, or monitors of some sort. But some are living things which eat their hosts, grow fat, and then tear them apart. These implants have been put in place by the very creatures you see down there, milling around all naked and innocent. They claim there is no infection among them, even though we know they are infected right up the yin-yang and the old wazoo and everywhere else. I have seen these things at work for 25 years or more, and I tell you, this is it. This is the invasion. This is the Super Bowl of Super Bowls, and you fellas are on defense. They are not helpless little ETs, boys waiting around for someone to give them a New England telephone card so that they can phone home. They are a disease. They are a cancer. Praise Jesus. And boys, we are one big hot radioactive shot of chemotherapy. Do you hear me, boys? No affirmatives this time. No Rogers. No I copy that. Raw cheers, nervous and neurotic jigging and eagerness. The comlink bulged with them. Cancer, boys, they are cancer. That's the best I can put it. Although, as you know, I'm no talker. Owen, do you copy? Copy, boss. Flat and calm. Damn him. Well, let him be cool. Let him be cool while he could. Owen Underhill was all finished. Kurtz raised the paper hat and looked at it admiringly. Owen Underhill was over. What is it down there, Owen? What is it shuffling around that ship? What is it forgot to put on their pants and shoes before they left the house this morning? Cancer, boss. That's right. Now you give the order and in we go. And with great deliberation, knowing that the men in the gunships would be watching them, never had he given such a sermon, never, and not a word of pre-planned unless it is dreams. He turned his own hat round backward. Owen watched Tony Edwards turn his Mets cap around so that the bill pointed down the nape of his neck. Heard Bryson and Bertinelli racking the .50s and understood this was really happening. They were going hot. He could get in the car and ride or stand in the road and get run down. Those were the only choices Kurtz had left him. And there was something more, something bad he remembered from long ago when he had been, 8? 7, maybe even younger. He had been out on the lawn of his house, the one in Paducah. His father still at work, his mother off somewhere, probably at the Grace Baptist, getting ready for one of her endless bake sales, unlike Kurtz, where Randy Underhill said praise Jesus, she meant it. And an ambulance had pulled up next door at the Rapelos. No siren, but lots of flashing lights. 2 men in jumpsuits, very much like the coverall Owen now wore, had gone running up the Rapelos walk, unfolding a gleaming stretcher, never even breaking stride. It was like a magic trick. Less than 10 minutes later, they were back out with Mrs. Rapelo on the stretcher. Her eyes had been closed. Mr. Rapelo came along behind her, not even bothering to close the door. Mr. Rapelo, who was Owen's daddy's age, looked suddenly as old as a grampy. It was another magic trick. Mr. Rapelo glanced to his right as the men loaded his wife into the ambulance and saw Owen kneeling on his lawn in his short pants and playing with his ball. They say it was a stroke," Mr. Rapaloe called. "St. Mary's Memorial, tell your mother, Owen." And then he climbed into the back of the ambulance, and the ambulance drove away. For the next 5 minutes or so, Owen continued to play with his ball, throwing it up and catching it, but in between the throws and catches, he kept looking at the door Mr. Rapaloe had left open and thinking he ought to close it. That closing it would be what his mother called a Christian act of charity. Finally, he got up and crossed to the Rapaloes' lawn. The Rapaloes had been good to him. Nothing really special, nothing to get up in the night and write home about, his mother would have said. But Mrs. Rapaloe made a lot of cookies and always remembered to save him some. Many were the bowls of frosting and cookie dough he had scraped clean in chubby, cheery Mrs. Rapaloe's kitchen. And then Mr. Rapaloe had shown him how to make paper airplanes that really flew. 3 different kinds, so the Rapaloes deserved charity, Christian charity, but when he stepped through the open door of the Rapaloes' house, he had known perfectly well that Christian charity wasn't the reason he was there. Doing Christian charity did not make your dingus hard. For 5 minutes, or maybe it was 15 minutes, or an hour, the time passed like time in a dream. Owen had just walked around in the Rapaloes' house, doing nothing, but all the time his dingus had just been as hard as a rock. So hard it throbbed like a second heartbeat, and you would think something like that would hurt, but it hadn't. It had felt good, and all these years later he recognized that silent wandering for what it had been, foreplay. The fact that he had nothing against the Rapaloes, and that, in fact, liked the Rapaloes somehow made it even better. If he was caught, he never was. He could say, "I don't know," if asked why he did it, and be telling the gods honest. Not that he did so much. In the downstairs bathroom, he found a toothbrush with Dick printed on it. Dick was Mr. Rapaloe's name. Owen tried to piss on the bristles of Mr. Rapaloe's toothbrush. That was what he wanted to do, but his dingus was too hard and no piss would come out, not a single drop. So he spat on the bristles instead, then rubbed the spit in and put the brush back in the toothbrush holder. In the kitchen, he poured a glass of water over the electric stove burners. Then he took a large china serving platter from the sideboard. "They said it was the stork," Owen said, holding the platter over his head. "It must be a baby, because he said it was a stork." And then he heaved the platter into the corner, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. Once that was done, he had fled from the house. Whatever had been inside him, the thing that had made his dingus hard and his eyeballs feel too big for their sockets, the shattering sound of the plate had broken it, popped it like a pimple, and if his parents hadn't been so worried about Mrs. Rapaloe, they almost certainly would have seen something wrong with him. As it was, they probably just assumed he was worried about Mrs. R too. For the next week he had slept little, and what sleep he did get had been haunted by bad dreams. In one of these, Mrs. Rapaloe came home from the hospital with a baby the stork had brought her, only the baby was black and dead. Owen had been all but consumed with guilt and shame. Never to the point of confessing, however, what in God's name would he have said when his Baptist mother asked him what had possessed him. And yet, he never forgot the blind pleasure of standing in the bathroom with his shorts down around his knees, trying to piss on Mr. Rapaloe's toothbrush, or the thrill that had gusted through him when the serving platter shattered. If he had been older, he would have cum in his pants, he supposed. The purity was in the senselessness. The joy was in the sound of the shatter. The afterglow was the slow and the pleasurable wallow in remorse for having done it and the fear of being caught. Mr. Rapaloe had said it was a stork, but when Owen's father came in that night, he told him it was a stroke, that a blood vessel in Mrs. Rapaloe's brain had sprung a leak, and that was a stroke. And now, here it was again, all of that. Maybe this time I will come, he thought. It'll certainly be a lot of goddamn grander than trying to piss on Mr. Rapaloe's toothbrush. And then he turned his own hat around. Same basic concept, though. Owen, Kurtz's voice. Are you there, son? If you don't roger me right now, I'm going to assume you either can't or won't. Boss, I'm here. Voice steady. In his mind's eye, he saw a sweaty little boy holding a china serving platter over his head. Boys, are you ready to kick a little interstellar ass? The roar of affirmation that included one goddamn right and one let's tear them up. What do you want first, boys? Squad anthem and fucking stones right now. Anyone want out? Sing out. Radio silence. On some other frequency, where Owen could never go again, the grayboys were pleading in famous voices. Starboard and below were the little Kiowa OH-58. Owen didn't need binoculars to see Kurtz with his own head now turned around, Kurtz watching him. The newspaper was still on his lap, now for some reason folded into a triangle. For 6 years, Owen Underhill had needed no second chances, which was good because Kurtz didn't give them. In his heart, Owen supposed he had always known that. He would think about that later, however, if he had to. One final coherent thought flared in his mind. You are the cancer, Kurtz, you! And then died. Here was a perfect darkness in its place. Blue group, this is Blue Boy leader. Coming on me, commence firing at 200 yards. Avoid hitting the Blue Boy if possible. But if you're going to sweep those motherfuckers clean, Conk, play the anthem. Gene Conkling flipped the switch and racked a CD in the Discman sitting on the floor of the Blue Boy 2. Owen, no longer inside himself, leaned forward in Blue Boy leader and cranked the volume. Mick Jagger, the voice of the Rolling Stones, filled his earphones. Owen raised his hand and Kurtz snapped him a salute. Whether sarcastic or sincere, Owen neither knew nor cared. And then Owen brought his arm down, as Jagger sang the anthem, the one they always played when they went in hot. The helicopters dropped, tightened, and flew to target. The grey boys, the one that were left, stood beneath the shadow of their ship, which lay in turn in the end of the shattered isle of trees it had destroyed in its final descent. They made no initial effort to run or hide. In fact, half of them actually stepped forward on their naked, toeless feet, squelching in the melting snow, the muck, the shattered fuzz of reddish-gold moss. These faced the oncoming line of gunships, long-fingered, hands raised, showing they were empty. Their huge black eyes gleamed in the dull daylight. The gunships did not slow, although all of them heard the final transmissions briefly in their heads. Please don't hurt us. We are helpless. We are dying. With that, twining through it like a pigtail, came the voice of Mick Jagger. The gunships heeled around as briskly as a marching band doing a square turn on the 50-yard line of the Rose Bowl. And the .50s opened up. The bullets plowed into the snow, struck dead branches from already wounded trees, struck pallid little sparks from the edge of the great ship. They ripped into the bunched grey boys standing with their arms upraised and tore them apart. Arms spun free of rudimentary bodies, spouting a kind of pink sap. Heads exploded like gourds, raining a reddish backsplash of their ship and their shipmates. Not blood, but that mossy stuff as if their heads were full of it. Not really heads at all, but gristly produce baskets. Several of them were cut into two in the midsection and went down with their hands still raised in surrender. As they fell, the grey bodies went a dirty white and seemed to boil. A few greys, still standing under the lip of the ship, turned as if to run, but there was nowhere to go. Most of them were shot down immediately. The last few survivors, maybe 4 in all, retreated into the scant shadows. They seemed to be doing something, fiddling with something, and Owen had a horrible premonition. "I can get them," came crackling over the radio. That was DeForest in Blue Boy 4, almost panting with eagerness and anticipating Owen's order to go for it. The Chinook dropped almost to ground level, its rotors kicking up snow and muddy water in a filthy blizzard. battering the underbrush flat. "No, negative. Belay that. Back off. Resume station plus 50. Owen shouted and whacked Tony's shoulder. Tony, looking only slightly odd in the transparent mask over his mouth and nose, yanked back on the yoke, and the Blue Boy leader rose in the unsteady air. Even over the music, the mad bongos, the chorus going hoo-hoo, Sympathy for the Devil hadn't played through its conclusion even a single time. At least not yet. Owen could hear his crew grumbling. The Kiowa he saw was already small but distant. Whatever his mental peculiarities might be, Kurtz was no fool, and his instincts were exquisite. "Ah, boss!" DeForest, sounding not just disappointed but on fire. Say again, return to station, Blue Group, return!" The explosion hammered him back in the seat and tossed the Chinook upward like a toy. Beneath the roar, he heard Tony Edwards cursing and rustling with the yoke. There were screams from behind them, but while most of the crew was injured, they lost only Pinky Bryson, who had been leaning out the bay for a better look and fell when the shockwave hit. Got it! Tony yammered, but Owen thought it was at least 30 seconds before Tony actually did. Seconds felt like hours. On the sound systems, the anthem had cut off. A fact did not bode well for Conk and the boys in Blue Boy 2. Tony swung Blue Boy leader around, and Owen saw the windscreen Perpex was cracked in two places. Behind them, someone was still screaming. Mac Cavanaugh, it turned out, had somehow managed to lose 2 fingers. "Holy shit!" Tony muttered, and then, "You saved your bacon, boss! Thanks!" Owen barely heard him. He was looking back at the remains of the ship, which now lay at least 3 pieces. It was hard to tell because the ship was flying and the air had turned a hazy reddish-orange. It was a little easier to see the remains of DeForest's gunship. It lay canted on its side in the muck, with bubbles bursting all around it. On the port side, a long piece of busted rotor floated in the water like a giant's canoe paddle. About 50 yards away, more rotors protruded, black and crooked, from the furious ball of yellow-white fire. That was Conkling and Blue Boy 2. Graggle and bleep from the radio, Blakey and Blue Boy 3. "Boss! Hey, boss! I see..." 3, this is Leader, I want you to... Leader, this is 3, I see survivors. Repeat, I see Blue Boy 4 survivors, at least 3, no, 4, I'm going down to... Negative, Blue Boy 3, not at all. Resume station 50, belay that. Station plus 150. 150 and do it now. But sir, boss, I mean, I can see Fragment, he's on fucking fire. Joe Blakey, listen up. No mistaking Kurt's rasp. Kurtz had gotten clear of the red crap in plenty of time. Almost, Owen thought as if he knew what was going to happen. Get your ass out of there now, or I guarantee by the next week you'll be shoveling camel shit in the hot climate where booze is illegal. Out! Nothing more from Blue Boy 3. The 2 surviving gunships pulled back to their original rally point plus 150 yards. Owen sat watching the furious upward spiral of the Ripley fungus, wondering if Kurtz had known, just intuited, wondering if he and Blakey had cleared the area in time. Because they were infectious, of course. Whatever the Grey Boy said, they were infectious. Owen didn't know if that had justified what they had just done, but he thought the survivors of Ray Forest Blue Boy 4 were most likely dead men walking. Or worse, live men changing. "Owen?" The radio. Tony looked at him, eyebrows raised. "Owen!" Sighing, Owen flicked the toggle over to Kurt's close channel with his chin. "I'm here, boss." Kurtz sat in the Kiowa with the newspaper hat still in his lap. He and Freddie were wearing their masks, so were the rest of the boys in the attack group. Likely even the poor fellows now on the ground were still wearing them. The masks were probably unnecessary, but Kurtz, who had no mention of contracting Ripley if he could avoid it, was the big cheese. Among other things, he was supposed to set an example. Besides, he played the odds. As for Freddie Johnson, well, he had plans for Freddie. "I'm here, boss," Underhill said in his phones. "That was good shooting, better flying, and superlative thinking. You saved some lives. You and I are back where we were. Right back to square one, got that?" "I do, boss. Got it and appreciate it." And if you believe it, Kurtz thought, you are even stupider than you look. Behind Owen, Kavanaugh was still making noises, but the volume was decreasing now. Nothing from Joe Blakey, who was maybe coming to understand the implications of that gauzy red-gold whirlwind, which they might or might not have managed to avoid. "Everything okay, Buck?" Kurtz asked. "We have some injuries," Owen replied, "but basically 5 by. Work for the sweepers, though. It's a mess back there." Kurt's crow-like laughter came back, loud in Owen's headphones. "Freddie?" "Yes, boss. We need to keep an eye on Owen Underhill." "Okay." "If we need to leave suddenly Imperial Valley, Underhill stays here." Freddie Johnson said nothing, just nodded and flew the helicopter. Good lad. Knew which side of the line he belonged on, unlike some. Kurtz again turned to him. "Freddie, get us back to the godforsaken little store and don't spare the horses. I want to be there at least 15 minutes before Owen and Joe Blakey. 20 if possible." "Yes, boss. And I want a secure satellite uplink to Cheyenne Mountain." "You got it. Take about 5. "Make it 3, Buck. Make it 3. Kurtz settled back and watched the pine forest flow under them. So much forest. So much wildlife, not even a few human beings, most of them, at this time of the year, wearing orange. And a week from now, maybe in 72 hours, it would be all as dead as the mountains of the moon. A shame, but if there was one thing of which there was no shortage in Maine, it was woods. Kurtz spun the cocked hat on the end of his finger. If possible, he intended to see Owen Underhill wearing it after he had ceased breathing. He just wanted to hear if any of it had changed. Kurtz said softly. Freddie Johnson, who knew which side of his bread was buttered on, said nothing. Halfway back to Gosselin's and Kurtz's speedy little Kiowa, already a speck that might or might not still be there. Owen's eyes fixed on Tony Edwards' right hand, which was gripping one branch of Chinook's Y-shaped steering yoke. At the base of the right thumbnail, fine as a spill of sand, was a curving line of reddish gold. Owen looked down at his own hands, inspecting them as closely as Mrs. Jankowski had during personal hygiene, back in those long-ago days when the Rapelows had been their neighbors. He could see nothing yet, not on his, but Tony had his mark, and Owen guessed his own would come in time. Baptists the Underhills had been, and Owen was familiar with the story of Cain and Abel. "The voice of thy brothers crieth unto me from the ground," God had said, and he had sent Cain out to live in the land of Nod, in the east of Eden, with the low men, according to his mother. But before Cain was set loose to wander, God had put a mark upon him, so even the low men of Nod would know him for what he was. And now, seeing that red gold thread on the nail of Eddie's thumb and looking for it in his own hands and wrists, Owen guessed he knew what color Cain's mark had been. Suicide, Henry had discovered, had a voice. It wanted to explain itself. The problem was that it didn't speak much English. Mostly it lapsed into his own fractured pidgin. But it didn't matter. Just the talking seemed to be enough. Once Henry allowed suicide its voice, his life had improved enormously. He even had nights when he slept again. Not all of them, but enough. And he had never had a really bad day. Until today. It had been Jonesy's body on the Arctic cat. But the thing now inside his old friend was full of alien images and alien purpose. Jonesy might also still be inside? Henry rather thought he was, but if so, he was now so deep, so small and powerless to be of any use. Soon Jonesy would be gone completely, and that would likely be a mercy. Henry had been afraid the thing now running Jonesy would sense him, but it went by without slowing. Toward Pete, and then what? Then where? Henry didn't want to think, didn't want to care. At last, he started back to camp again, not because there was anything left at hole in the wall, but because there was no place else to go. As he reached the gate with its one-worded sign, Clarendon, he spat another tooth into his gloved hand, looked at it, then tossed it away. The snow was over, but the sky was still dark, and he thought the wind was picking up again. Had the radio said something about the storm with a 1-2 punch? He couldn't remember, wasn't sure it mattered. Somewhere to the west of him, a huge explosion hammered the day. Henry looked dully in that direction, but could see nothing. Something had either crashed or exploded. At least some of the nagging voices in his head had stopped. He had no idea if those things were related or not, no idea if he should care. He stepped through the open gate, walking on the packed snow marked with the tread of the departing Arctic cat, and approached hole in the wall. The generator brayed steadily, and above the granite slab that served as a welcome mat, the door stood open. Henry paused outside for a moment, examining the slab. At first he thought there was blood on it, but blood, either fresh or dried, did not have that unique red-gold sheen. No, he was looking at some sort of organic growth, moss or maybe fungus, and something else. Henry tipped his head back, flared his nostrils, and sniffed gently. He had a memory, both clear and absurd, of being in Mauritius a month ago with his ex-wife, smelling the wine the sommelier had just poured. Seeing Rhonda there across the table and thinking, we sniff the wine, dogs sniff each other's assholes, and it all comes to about the same. Then, in a flash, the memory of the milk running down his father's chin had come. He had smiled at Rhonda, he had smiled back, and he thought what a relief the end would be. And if it were done, then it were done quickly. What he smelled now wasn't wine but a marshy, sulphurous odor. For a moment he couldn't place it, then it came. The woman who had wrecked them, the smell of her wrong innards was here too. Henry stepped onto the granite slab, aware that he had come to this place for the last time, feeling the weight of all the years, the laughs, the talks, the beers, the occasional lid of pot, a food fight in 96 or maybe it was 97, the gunshots, that bitter mixed smell of powder and blood that meant deer season, the smell of death and friendship and childhood's brilliance. He stood there. He sniffed again. Much stronger, now more chemical than organic. Perhaps there was so much of it. He looked inside. There was more of that fuzzy, mildewy stuff on the floor. But you could see the hardwood. On the Navajo rug, however, it had already grown so thick that it was hard to make out the pattern. No doubt, whatever it was did better in the heat, but still the rate of growth was scary. Henry started to step in, then thought better of it. He backed 2 or 3 places away from the doorway instead and only stood there in the snow, very aware of his bleeding nose and the holes of his gums, where there had been teeth, when he woke up this morning. If that mossy stuff was producing some sort of airborne virus like Ebola or Hanta, he was probably cooked already. And anything he did would amount to no more than locking the barn door after the horse had been stolen. But there was no sense taking unnecessary risks, was there? He turned and walked around hole in the wall to the gulch side, still walking in the packed thread of the departed Arctic cat to keep from sinking into the new snow. The door to the shed was open too, and Henry could see Jonesy, yes, as clear as day. Jonesy pausing in the doorway before going in to get the snowmobile. Jonesy holding on to the side of the doorway with a casual hand. Jonesy listening to To the what? To the nothing. No crows cawing, no jays scolding, no woodpeckers pecking, no squirrels scuttering, and there was only the wind and that occasional padded plop as a clot of snow slid off the pine or spruce and hid the new snow beneath. The local wildlife was gone and moved on like goofy animals in a Gary Larson cartoon. He stood where he was for a moment, calling up his memory of the shed's interior. Pete would have done better. Pete would have stood there with his eyes closed and his forefinger sticking back and forth, then told you where everything was, right down to the smallest jar of screws. But in this case, Henry thought he could do without Pete's special skill. He'd been out here just yesterday looking for something to help him open a kitchen cabinet door that was swelled shut. He had seen then what he wanted now. Henry inhaled and exhaled rapidly several times, hyperventilating his lungs clean, then pressed his gloved hand tight over his mouth and nose and stepped in. He stood still for a moment, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the dim. He didn't want to be surprised by anything if he could help it. When he could see well again, Henry stepped across the empty place where the snowmobile had been. There was nothing on the floor now but an overlaid pattern of old stains. But there were more patches of that reddish gold crud growing on the green top which had covered the cat and was now cast aside in the corner. The work table was a mess, a jar of nails and one of screws overturned, so that what had been kept carefully separate was now mixed together. An old pipe holder that belonged to Lamar Clarendon, knocked on the floor and broken. All the drawers built into table's thickness yanked open and left that way. One of them, Beaver or Jonesy, had gone through this place like a whirlwind, looking for something. It was Jonesy. Yeah, Henry might never thought what it was, but it was Jonesy, he knew that. It had clearly been almighty important to him, or to both of them. Yeah, Henry might never know what it was, but it had been Jonesy, he knew that. And it had clearly been almighty important to him, or to both of them. Henry wondered if Jonesy has found it. He would probably never know that either. Meanwhile, what he wanted was clearly visible in the far corner of the room, hung on the nail above a pile of paint cans and spray guns. Still holding his hand over his mouth and nose, breath held, Henry crossed the interior of the shed. There were at least 4 of the little nose and mouth painter's masks, hanging from elastics which had lost most of their snap. He took them all and turned in time to see something move behind the door. He kept himself from gasping, but his heartbeat jumped, and all at once the double lungful of air that had gotten him this far seemed too hot and heavy. Nothing there either. It had just been his imagination. Then he saw that. Yeah, there was something. Light came in through the open door, a little more came in through the single dirty window over the table, and Henry had literally jumped at his own shadow. He left the shed in 4 big steps, the painter's masks swinging from his right hand. He held on to his lungful of decayed air until he had made 4 more steps along the packed track of the snowmobile, then let it out in an explosive rush. He bent over, hands planted on his thighs above his knees, small black dots flocking over his eyes and then dissolving. From the east came a distant crackle of gunfire. Not rifles, it was too loud and fast for that. Those were automatic weapons. In Henry's mind, there came a vision as clear as the memory of milk running down his father's chin, or Barry Newman fleeing his office with rockets on his heels. He saw the deer and the coons and the chucks and the feral dogs and the rabbits being cut down in their dozens and their hundreds as they tried to escape what was now pretty clearly a plague zone. He could see the snow turning red with their innocent but possibly contaminated blood. His vision hurt him in a way he had not expected, piercing through a place that wasn't dead but only dozing. This was the place that had resonated so strongly to Duddett's weeping, setting up a harmonic tone that made you feel as if your head was going to explode. Henry straightened up, saw fresh blood on the palm of his left glove, and cried, Ah, shit. At the sky in the voice that was both furious and amused. He had covered his mouth and nose. He had gotten the masks and was planning on wearing at least 2 when he went inside the hole in the wall. But he had completely forgotten the gash in his thigh, the one he'd gotten when the scout rolled over. If there had been a contaminant out there in the shed, something given off by the fungus, the chances were excellent that it was in him now. Not that the precautions he had taken were any such of a much. Henry imagined a sign, big red letters, reading, "Biohazard area. Please hold breath and cover any scratches you may have with your hand." He grunted laughter and started back toward the cabin. Well, good God, Maud. It wasn't as if he had planned to live forever anyway. Off to the east, the gunfire crackled on and on. Once again, standing outside hole-in-the-wall's open door, Henry felt in his back pocket for a handkerchief, without much hope of finding one, and didn't. 2 of the unadvertised attractions of spending time in the woods were urinating where you wanted and just leaning over and give a honk when your nose felt in need of a blow. There was something primarily satisfying about letting the piss and the snot fly, to men at least. When you thought about it, it was sort of a blue-eyed wonder what woman could love the best of them, let alone the rest of them. He took off his coat, the shirt under it, and the thermal undershirt beneath that. The final layer was faded Boston Red Sox t-shirt with Garcia Parra 5 on the back. Henry took this off, spun it into a bandage, and wrapped it around the blood-caked tear in the left leg of his jeans, thinking again that he was locking the barn door after the horse had been stolen. Still, you filled in the blanks, didn't you? Yes, you filled in the blanks and you printed neatly and legibly. These were the concepts upon which life ran. Even when life was running out, it seemed. He put the rest of his outerwear back on over his goosebumply top half, then donned 2 of the teardrop-shaped painter's masks. He considered fixing 2 of the other over his ears. Imagine those narrow bands of elastic crisscrossing the back of his head like straps of a shoulder holster, and burst out laughing. What else? Use the last mask to cover one eye? If it gets me, it gets me, he said, at the same time reminding himself that it wouldn't hurt to be careful. A little dose of careful never hurt a man, old Lamar used to say. Inside hole in the wall, the fungus, or mildew, or whatever it was, has gone forward appreciably, even during the short time Henry had been in the shed. The Navajo rug was now covered side to side, with not even the slightest pattern showing through. There were patches on the couch, the counter between the kitchen and the dining area, and on the seats of 2 or 3 stools which stood on the living room side of the counter. A crooked capillary of red gold fuzz ran up one leg of dining room table as if following a line of a spill, and Henry was reminded of how ants will congregate on even the thinnest track of spilled sugar. Perhaps the most distressing thing of all was the red gold fuzz of cobweb hanging high over the Navajo rug. Henry looked at it fixedly for several seconds before realizing what it really was. Lamar Clarendon's Dreamcatcher. Henry didn't think he would ever know exactly what had happened here, but of one thing he was sure. The Dreamcatcher had snared a real nightmare this time. You aren't going any farther in there, are you? Now that you have seen how fast it grows. Jonesy looked all right when he went by, but he wasn't all right, and you know it. You felt it. So you aren't really going on, are you? I think so, Henry said. The double thickness of masks bobbed on his face when he spoke. If it gets hold of me, why, I just have to kill myself. Laughing like Stubb in Moby Dick, Henry moved farther into the cabin. With one exception, the fungus grew in thin mats and clumps. The exception was in front of the bathroom door, where there were actual hill of fungus, all of it matted together and growing upward in the doorway, bearding both jambs to a height at least 4 feet. This hill-like clump of growth seemed to be lying over some grayish, spongy growth medium. On the side facing the living room, the grey stuff split in two, making a V shape that reminded Henry unpleasantly of splayed legs. As if someone had died in the doorway and the fungus had overgrown the corpse. Henry recalled an off-print from med school, some article he quickly scanned in search for something else. It had contained photographs, one of them a gruesome medical examiner shot he had never quite forgotten. He showed a murder victim dumped in the woods. The nude body discovered after approximately 4 days. There had been toadstools growing from the nape of the neck, the creases at the back of the knees, and from the cleft of the buttocks. 4 days, all right, but this place had been clean this morning. Only... Henry glanced at his watch and saw that it had stopped at 20 till 12. It was now Eastern Standard, no time at all. He turned and peeked behind the door, suddenly convinced that something was lurking there. Nah, nothing but Jonesy's Garand leaning against the wall. Henry started to turn away, then turned back again. The Garand looked clear of the goo, and Henry picked it up, loaded, safety on, one in the chamber. Good. Henry slung it over his shoulder and turned back toward the unpleasant red lump growing outside the bathroom door. The smell of ether mingled with something sulphurous and even more unpleasant was strong in there. He walked slowly across the room toward the bathroom, forcing himself forward a step at a time, afraid and increasingly certain that the red hump with the leg-like extrusions was all that remained of his friend, Beaver. In a moment he would see the straggly remains of Beaver's long black hair or his Doc Martens, which Beaver called his lesbian solidarity statement. The Beaver had gotten the idea that Doc Martens was a secret sign by which lesbians recognized each other, and no one could talk to him out of this. He was likewise convinced that people named Rothschild or Goldfarb ran the world, possibly from a bedrock deep bunker in Colorado. Beaver, whose preferred expression of surprise was, "Fuck me, Freddy." But there was absolutely no way of telling if the lump in the doorway had once been the Beaver, or indeed if it once had been anyone at all. There was only that suggestive shape. Something glinted in the spongy mass of growth, and Henry leaned a little closer, wondering if he did it if microscopic bits of fungus were already growing on the wet, unprotected surface of his eyes. The thing he spotted turned out to be the bathroom doorknob. Off to one side, sporting his own fuzz of growth, was a roll of friction tape. He remembered the mess scattered across the surface of the work table out back, the yanked open drawers, and this being what Jonesy had been out there looking for. A goddamn roll of tape? Something in his head, maybe the click, maybe not, said it was, but why? In God's name, why? In the last 5 months or so, as the suicidal thoughts came more frequently and visited for longer and longer periods of time, chatting in their pidgin language, Henry's curiosity had pretty much deserted him. Now it was raging as if it had awakened hungry. He had nothing to feed it, and Jonesy wanted to tape the door shut. Yeah, against what? Surely he and Beaver must have thought it wouldn't work against the fungus, which would just send his fingers creeping under the door. Henry looked into the bathroom and made a low grunting sound. Whatever obscene craziness had gone on, it had started and ended in there. He had no doubt of it. The room was red cave, the blue tiles almost completely hidden under drifts of the stuff. It had grown up to the base of the sink and the toilet as well. The seat's lid was back against the tank, and although he couldn't be positive, there was too much overgrowth to be positive. He thought that the ring itself had been broken inward. The shower curtain was now solid red gold instead of filmy blue. Most of it had been torn off the rings, which had grown their own vegetable beards and lay in the tub. Jutting from the edge of the tub, also overgrown with fungus, was a boot-clad foot. The boot was a Doc Marten. Henry was sure of it. He had found Beaver after all, it seemed. Memories of the day they had rescued Duddits suddenly filled him, so bright and clear it might have been yesterday. Beaver's wearing his goofy old leather jacket. Beaver talking Duddits' lunchbox and saying, "You like this show? But they never change their clothes." And then saying, "Fuck me, Freddy." Henry told the overgrown cabin. That's what he said. That's what he always said. Tears running from his eyes and down his cheeks. If it was just wetness the fungus wanted, and judging by the jungle growing out of the toilet bowl, it liked wetness just fine. It could land on him and have a feast. Henry didn't much care. He had Jonesy's rifle. The fungus could start on him, but he could make sure he was long gone before it ever got to the desert coast, if it came to that. It probably would. He was sure he'd seen a few rug remnants heaped up in one corner of the shed. Henry debated going out and getting them. He could lay them down on the bathroom door, walk over them, and then get a better look into the tub. But to what purpose? He knew that was Beaver, and he had no real desire to see his old friend. Author of such witticisms as "Kiss My Bender," being overgrown by red fungus as a pallid corpse in that long-ago medical off-print, had been growing in his own colony of toadstools. It might have answered some of his questions about what had happened, yes, perhaps, but Henry didn't think that likely. Mostly, what he wanted was to get out of here. The fungus was creepy, but there was something else, an even creepier sensation that he was not alone. Henry backed away from the bathroom door. There was a paperback on the dining table, a pattern of dancing devils with pitchforks on its covers. One of Jonesy's, no doubt, already growing into his own colony of crud. He became aware of the bickering noise from the west, one that quickly rose to a thunder. Helicopters, and not just one this time, a lot, big ones. They sounded as if they were coming at rooftop level, and Henry ducked without even being aware of it. Images of dozen Vietnam War movies filled his head, and he was momentarily sure that they would open up their machine guns, spraying the house, or maybe they'd hose it down with napalm. They passed over without doing either, but came close enough to rattle the cups and dishes on the kitchen shelves. Henry straightened up as the thunder began to fade, becoming first a chatter, then a harmless drone. Perhaps they had gone off to join the animal slaughter at the east end of the Jefferson Tract. Let them. He was going to get the fuck out of here and what? Exactly what? While he was thinking this question over, there was a sound from one of the two downstairs bedrooms. A rustling sound. This was followed by a moment of silence, just long enough for Henry to decide it was his imagination pulling a little more over time. Then there came a series of low clicks and chitters, almost the sound of a mechanical toy, a tin monkey or parrot, maybe on the verge of running down. Gooseflesh broke all over Henry's body. The spit dried up in his mouth. The hairs on the back of his neck began to straighten in bunches. "Get out of here! Run!" Before he could listen to that voice and let it get a hold on him, he crossed to the bedroom door in big steps, unshouldering the Garand as he went. The adrenaline dumped into his blood, and the world stood forth brightly. Selective perception, that unacknowledged gift to the safe and cozy, fell away, and he saw every detail. The trail of blood which ran from bedroom to bathroom, a discarded slipper, that weird red mold growing on the wall of the shape of a handprint. Then he went through the door. It was on the bed, whatever it was. To Henry it looked like a weasel or a woodchuck, with its legs amputated and a long bloody tail strung out behind it like an afterbirth. Only no animal he had ever seen, with the possible exception of the moray eel at the Boston Seaquarium, had such disproportionately large black eyes. And another similarity, when it yawned upon the rudimentary line that was his mouth, it revealed a nest of shocking fangs as long and thin as hatpins. Behind it, pulsing on the blood-soaked sheet, were 100 or more orange and brown eggs. They were the size of large marbles and coated with a murky, snot-like slime. Within each, Henry could see a moving, hair-like shadow. The weasel thing rose up like a snake emerging from a snake charmer's basket and chittered at him. It lurched on the bed, Jonesy's bed, but seemed unable to move much. Its glossy black eyes glared. Its tail, except Henry thought it might actually be some sort of gripping tentacle, lashed back and forth and then layered itself over as many as eggs it could reach, as if protecting them. Henry realized he was saying the same word, no, over and over in a monotonous drone like a helpless neurotic who has been loaded up on Thorazine. He shouldered the rifle, aimed, and tracked the thing's repulsive wedge of head as it twitched and dodged. It knows what this is. It knows at least that much, Henry thought coldly, and then he squeezed the trigger. It was a close range, and the creature wasn't up to much in the way of evasion. Either laying its eggs had exhausted it, or it hasn't doing well in the cold. With the main door open, hole in the wall had gotten quite cold indeed. The report was very loud in the closed room, and the thing's upraised head disintegrated in a liquid splatter that blew back against the wall in strings and clots. Its blood was the same red gold as the fungus. The decapitated body tumbled off the bed and onto the litter of clothes Henry didn't recognize. A brown coat, an orange flagman's vest, a pair of jeans with cuffs. None of them had ever worn cuffed jeans in junior high school. Those who did had been branded shit-kickers. Several of the eggs tumbled off with the body. Most landed on either the clothes or the litter of Jonesy's books and remained whole. But a couple hit the floor and broke open. Cloudy stuff like spoiled egg white oozed out, about a tablespoon from each egg. Within it were those hairs, writhing and twisting and seeming to glare at Henry with black eyes the size of pinheads. Looking at them made them feel like screaming. He turned and walked jerkily out of the room on legs, with no more feeling in them than the legs of a table. He felt like a puppet being manipulated by someone who means well but has just begun to learn his craft. He had no real idea where he was going until he reached the kitchen and bent over the cabinet under the sink. "I'm the Eggman, I'm the Eggman, I'm the walrus, goo-goo jube." He didn't sing this, but declaimed it in a loud, horatory voice that he didn't realize was in his repertoire. It was the voice of the ham actor from the 19th century. The idea called up an image, God knew why, of Edwin Booth, dressed as D'Artagnan. Plumed hat and all, quoted from the lyrics of John Lennon, and Henry uttered two loud laugh syllables, "Ha ha!" "I'm going insane," he thought, but it was okay. Better D'Artagnan reciting "I'm the Walrus" than the image of that thing's blood splattering onto the wall or the mold-covered Doc Marten sticking out of the bathtub, or worst of all, those eggs splitting open and releasing a load of twitching hairs with eyes, all those eyes looking at him. He moved aside the dish detergent and the floor bucket, and there it was, a yellow can of Sparks barbecue lighter fluid. The inept puppeteer who had taken him over advanced Henry's arms in a series of jerks, then clammed his right hand on the Sparks can. He carried it back across the living room, paused long enough to take the box of wooden matches from the mantel. "I am he and you are me and we are all together," he declaimed, and stepped briskly back into Jonesy's bedroom before the terrified person inside his head could seize the controls, turn him and make him run away. That person wanted to make him run until he fell down unconscious or dead. The eggs on the bed were also splitting open. 24 or more of those hairs were crawling around the blood-soaked sheet or squirming on Jonesy's pillow. One raised its number of a head and chittered at Henry, a sound almost too thin and high-pitched to be heard. Still not allowing himself any pause. If he paused, he would never get started again, in any direction save doorward, that was. Henry took 2 steps to the foot of the bed. One of the hairs came sliding across the floor toward him, propelling itself with its tail like a spermatozoon under a microscope. Henry stepped on it, thumping the red plastic cap off the spout of the can as he did. He aimed the spout at the bed and squeezed, flicking his wrist back and forth, making sure he got plenty on the floor as well. When the lighter fluid hit the hair-like things, they made high, mewling cries like kittens which had been just born. "Eggman, Eggman, walrus!" He stepped on another of the hairs and saw that third was clinging to the leg of his jeans, holding on with its wisp of a tail and trying to bite through the cloth with its still soft teeth. "Eggman," Henry muttered and scraped it off with the side of its other boot. When it tried to squirm away, he stepped on it. He was suddenly aware that he was drenched with sweat, sopping from head to toe. If he went out in the cold like this, and he would have to, he couldn't stay here. He'd probably catch his death. "Can't stay here, can't take no rest," Henry cried in his new hortatory voice. He opened up the matchbox, but his hands were shaking so badly he spilled half of them on the floor. More of the thread-like worms were crawling toward him. They might not know much, but they knew he was the enemy, all right. They knew that. Henry got hold of the match, held it up, put his thumb against the tip. A trick Pete had taught him in a way back when. It was your friends who always taught you the finer things, wasn't it? Like how to give your old pal Beaver a Viking funeral and get rid of those noisome little snakelets at the same time. "Eggman!" He scratched the tip of the match and it popped fire. The smell of the burning sulfur was like the smell that had greeted when he stepped into the cabin. Like the smell of a burly woman's farts. "Walrus!" He flung the match at the foot of the bed, where there was a crumpled duvet, now soaked with lighter fluid. For a moment the flame guttered down blue around the little stick, and Henry thought it would go out. Then there was a soft flump sound, and the duvet grew a modest crown of yellow flames. "Go, go, Jube!" The flames crawled up the sheet, turning the blood-soaked into it black. It reached the mass of jelly-coated eggs, tasted them, and found them good. There was a series of thick popping sounds as the eggs began to burst. More of those mewling cries as the worms burned, sizzling noises as fluid ran out of the burst eggs. Henry backed out of the room, squirting lighter fluid as he went. He got halfway across the Navajo rug before the can ran empty. He tossed it aside, scratched another match, and tossed it. This time the flump was immediate, and the flames sprang up orange. The heat baked against the sweaty, shiny face, and he felt a sudden urge. It was both strong and joyful to cast the painter's mask aside and simply stride into the fire. Hello, heat. Hello, summer. Hello, darkness, my old friend. What stopped him was as simple as it was powerful. If he pulled the pin now, he would have suffered the unpleasant awakening of all his quiescent emotions to no purpose. He would never be clear on the details of what had happened here, but he might get at least some answers from whoever was flying the helicopters and shooting the animals. If they didn't just shoot him too, that was. At the door, Henry was struck by a memory so clear that his heart dried out inside him. Beaver kneeling in front of Duddits, who's trying to put on his sneaker backwards. "Let me fix that, man," Beaver says, and Duddits, looking at him with wide-eyed perplexity that you could only love, replies, "Fit Nick?" Henry was crying again. "So long, Beav," he said. "I love you, man. And that's straight from the heart." And then he stepped out into the cold.